Welcome to this narrated PowerPoint on our top 21 and a half teaching tips. I'm Jay Rasmussen, and I currently serve as the Faculty Development Coordinator for CAS. I teach and supervise extensively in our undergrad education program, and I teach and direct a fully online MA and Ed program. What Dan and I present in this narrated PowerPoint will stem from our philosophical beliefs about teaching and learning. The next slide captures some of what I feel is true about learning. Tell me, and I'll listen. Show me, and I'll understand. Involve me, and I'll learn.
I'm Dan Swanson. I teach a variety of classes at the undergraduate level, including educational technology, middle-level education, statistical analysis, and NAS physics. I'm the program director for the International Baccalaureate Certificate Program, and I also teach an occasional graduate-level course. This slide reveals, in part, my philosophy of education.
Throughout this presentation, we'll present 2 tips, or strategies, for each of the 11 categories that you see on this slide and the following one. We'll begin first by looking at course planning, then community building, use of instructional strategies, facilitating discussion, and then building student relationships. Let's look at the next slide now. We'll then look at tips related to faith integration, cooperative group learning, reading and writing in the content areas, use of technology, assessment of learning, and then providing student feedback. Both Dan and I like to operate with learning targets, and we have just one for this presentation. We'll return to this at the end of our PowerPoint, so please consider which of the 21 and a half tips or strategies you'd like to try in your instructional setting. Let's begin with the category of course planning. When it comes to course planning, whether it's for a new course or one I simply plan to revise, I like to start with a process known as curriculum mapping. One of the simplest ways to go about this is to create an organizer that looks like what you see on the screen. The process begins with you writing individual objectives about the knowledge, skills, and dispositions you want your learners able to display. Next, you create one essential question for each objective. This is something you can share with students, and it should be worded in a manner that would interest students in the investigation of the content area. Next, you specify one or more assessments that you can align up to the objective. A good way to think about this is to consider what evidence you want students to produce so you and they are able to verify that the objective was met. The actual assessment could be traditional or performance assessment, and it's possible that a single assessment could effectively assess multiple objectives. Once the assessments are in place, you can begin to identify and scaffold the essential content that will enable students to succeed with the assessments. Once you've determined the content, you then decide which instructional strategy is best suited to deliver the content. And do think about multiple engagement strategies, such as interactive lectures, case studies, and a number of the tips that Dan and I will share later in this presentation. The process then concludes with you listing all instructional resources that you'll use for a given outcome. This style of map is especially helpful when building or revising a course, but the same process can be used to help build entire programs. Departments have also found it helpful to have individual faculty create maps of existing courses and then share their maps in department meetings as a way of understanding what one another is doing and to identify the gaps and overlaps in content that's addressed.
In terms of course planning, I like to make use of the backwards design process. In a number of ways, it is similar to planning a trip. My wife and I are hoping to get all 3 of our kids, Anna, Joe, and Eric, to all 50 states by the time they are 18. Right now, we are at 44 states. When we plan trips, it is not possible to plan specific activities without knowing the destination. Likewise, when planning a course or a unit, it is essential that one identifies the desired results in terms of objectives or learning targets that are measurable. In addition to language targets and content targets, enduring understandings and essential questions can also be included. Once the learning targets are set, the evidence that the students produce to show that they have met the targets is determined. Evidence can include such things as quizzes, tests, prompts, observations, dialogues, work samples, essays, and papers. One thing to consider is allowing students to have the chance to self-assess or reflect on their learning. Finally, the key events for teaching and learning should be planned. Wiggins and McTeague, in Understanding by Design, contend that educators should consider the where-to during this stage. Let me describe the where-to. The W is for where. Help the students know where the unit is going and what is expected. Help the teacher know where the students are coming from, and this includes prior knowledge and the student interests. H is for hook. Hook all students and hold their interest. E is for equip. Equip students, help them experience the key ideas and explore the issues. R is for rethink and revise. Provide opportunities to rethink and revise their understanding and their work. E is for evaluate. Allow students to evaluate their work and its implications. T is for tailored. Tailored or personalized to the different needs, interests, abilities of the learners. And finally, O is organized. Organized to maximize initial and sustained engagement as well as effective learning.
When I think about community building, I love to use a process I call speed dating, for lack of a better name. I use this strategy the first time I meet with a group of learners, and the process works well with up to about 30 students. You may need to leave the room, however, to find adequate space. I begin the process by numbering off learners as ones and twos, and then all the ones come into the center of the room and stand in a small, tight circle and face outward. The twos then all come forward and stand directly in front of one of the ones. At this point, I ask a question that each paired 1 and 2 are expected to answer. Once learners have had adequate time to respond to the first question, I ask them to rotate clockwise, and then I ask a new question. The first time I do this activity, I use get-to-know-you type questions. Something like, how would your best friend describe you? What is your passion in life, and where do you think it came from? What are you most looking forward to in this course? What are you most concerned about when taking this course, etc.? Once the course is underway, I use the process for review purposes, and I'll ask content-specific questions related to essential material. Generally speaking, I like to use about 5 to 6 questions, and the whole process generally takes about 10 to 12 minutes.
Community building is an extremely important part of building a positive classroom environment. Peter Block, in his book Community, The Structure of Belonging, urges us to consider the 6 categories that are listed in the slide when building community. Dr. Asmussen, based on the work of Block, has organized questions in each of the categories that are related to the educational setting. Invitation. How did you come to be enrolled in this class at this time? Possibility. What does success look like for you in this class? How is it measured? Ownership. How valuable of an experience do you plan for this to be? Dissent. What are your doubts and reservations as you start this class? Commitment. What promises are you willing to make to your peers in order to shape a healthy class environment? Gifts. What gifts and talents are you prepared to share with your classmates? What do you bring to this class that will make it better? There are many ways to use these questions to build community in the classroom. For example, I've had students respond to some of these questions prior to the first day of class using an online survey. Once in class, students engage with the questions through individual free writes, sharing in small groups with partners, and in class discussions. Block's questions encourage students to see that they have gifts and talents that they bring to the classroom that can make the learning experience more meaningful for all involved.
When it comes to using instructional strategies, I'm a huge fan of using Jing, a free screen capture tool to show and tell about any detailed process or products that my students need to produce. For example, when I was trying to get students to properly use APA style, I created this Jing and put the link on the Moodle site. Students made repeated use of this resource and reported how helpful it was to be able to go back and replay the Jing. Learning how to create a free Jing literally takes only minutes, and the information can be downloaded from the site listed on this screen.
I encourage you to consider the elements of flow when developing instructional strategies. Flow theory was developed by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi using the experience sampling method, which involves sampling over 100,000 people worldwide. There were initial interviews and questionnaires. The data collection itself involved the use of a device that signaled people 8 times per day to record their feelings and what they were doing. Data analysis revealed that flow is likely to occur when certain conditions are present. Although Csikszentmihalyi discusses numerous conditions in his various writings, Dr. Rasmussen organized these into 4 conditions that you see on the slide. Csikszentmihalyi, in 1990, described flow as a state in which people are so involved in activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at a great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. It is also described by others as fully immersed, fully absorbed, completely focused, free from worry and self-consciousness, in the zone and in the groove, and unaware of time passing. The benefits include intense feelings of enjoyment and a strong correlation with the following: performance enhancement, further development of skills and personal growth, and higher subsequent motivation to perform. I encourage you to consider planning activities that incorporate 3 or 4 elements of these conditions.
Facilitating discussion is a challenge that we all face. I've noticed through the years that our learners very quickly begin to build habits of how they'll participate or not participate when they enter our classrooms. If they go for several hours of limited or no speaking, that's the pattern that they're likely to carry into for the remainder of your course. For this very reason, I make it a point of structuring speaking opportunities within the first 20 minutes of my first class, and then about every 20 minutes in subsequent classes. Early in the course, I prefer to use partner or small group discussions with no more than 4 learners per group. This helps students overcome fears associated with speaking in front of large groups, and it lessens the number one fear that students have, that they will appear dumb or will be laughed at or ridiculed by their peers. I like to provide a clear written prompt built into my PowerPoint presentation, and at times I'll ask learners to write a response before they speak with others. The writing serves as a rehearsal time for learners, and they often feel more comfortable sharing their thoughts. If I have a spontaneous question in mind and I'm not using partners or groups, I'll often preface my question with something like this: I'm going to give you something to just think about before we hear answers. Have an idea formulated in your mind. Then I'll ask for volunteers or call on individuals to respond to the question. When working in groups, learners are usually curious about the discussions in other groups, and for this reason, I like to have one individual report back to the large group. At times, I'll identify the group spokesperson, or at other times, I'll allow them to select an individual.
It is essential to facilitate discussions in such a way that all students have a chance to engage with each other, with the material, and with the teacher. Often classroom discussions only allow for a small number of students to share their ideas. In addition, certain students may not feel comfortable sharing their ideas in a large group setting without first having the chance to process their thoughts. For those reasons, I like to give students the chance to engage with the material prior to class using a visible thinking routine. The material students interact with could include text, videos, or works of art. Visible thinking routines were developed at Harvard University and based on extensive research. According to the Harvard Visible Thinking Routine website, visible thinking makes extensive use of learning routines that are thinking rich. These routines are simple structures for example, a set of questions or a short sequence of steps that can be used across various grade levels and content. What makes them routines versus merely strategies is that they get used over and over again in the classroom so that they become part of the fabric of the classroom's culture. The routines become the ways in which students go about the process of learning. Referring to the third column on the slide, when students come to class already having used a thinking routine to engage with material, they work in groups of 2, 3, or 4. In those groups, they share part of their routine in an effort to make their thinking visible to themselves and each other. At that point, the discussion can move to a large group discussion, either in class or online.
Building student relationships is at the heart and soul of what good teachers do. For maximum learning, I'm convinced that the more engaged the learner is with the 3 dimensions shown on this slide, the more they'll learn. I like to see engagement with the instructor, with the content, and with peers in the class. For me, the most critical factors in building instructor-student relationships are learning names immediately and taking an interest in learners on a personal level. This can come through small talk before class and in discussions held in the halls or in my office. I'm fully convinced that our strength as an instructor in front of a group of learners is really based on our relationship with each of them as individuals.
Building student relationships is at the heart of education. Sometimes it can be difficult to get to know students in larger classes. A friend of mine who teaches at Macalester College shared the idea of 10-minute chats. I occasionally use these chats in some of my larger classes. The 10-minute chat works as follows. During the first 2 weeks of the semester, each student is required to stop by my office for a 5 to 10-minute talk. I start the conversation by thanking the student for taking the time to stop by my office. Then, I often ask a question about what brought them to Bethel. I try to make the conversation about them, not me, as I take the time in class to introduce myself. I have found these conversations to be a great way to get to know students. Depending on your grading philosophy, this could be an expectation or an assignment. Either way, I have found that the vast majority of students embrace this opportunity.
My latest operating principle as a teacher is that whoever does the most work learns the most. And I believe this principle holds true with faith integration as well. For example, for many years in a measurement and assessment course, I posed the following series of rhetorical questions that I then proceeded to answer as eloquently as possible. My questions were, what assessment principles and practices do you see modeled in Scripture? How have you seen these principles work themselves out in your workplace or life? And where do these principles most challenge you? My instruction is different now in that I pose the same questions, but I put the responsibility on them to wrestle with the issues. With this approach, I found that I'm getting far better insights than I was ever coming up with on my own. On the screen is a sample of what my students had to say in a recent online discussion forum.
Bringing faith into the classroom is an important part of all my classes. When people find out what I do, one of the first questions I often get is, what is your favorite thing about working at Bethel? My answer is student-led devotions. Student-led devotions are extremely meaningful and relevant. Students have a way of challenging and encouraging their peers in ways I cannot. The details are as follows. The first day of class, I have students that want to share devotions sign up. Generally, I have about 40 to 50 to 60% of my students sign up, and that works out to about 1 devotion per week. Devotions last anywhere from 30 seconds to 4 to 5 minutes. Students share a wide variety of things, including a daily devotion, something from a book they are studying in a book group, a topic that has been on their heart, a challenge related to something going on at Bethel or in their discipline, or something from a Bible study in which they are involved.
At this point, please take a few minutes to reflect on the strategies you've heard so far. Which of these sound like something workable for your group of learners, your discipline, and your teaching style?
The next category is cooperative group learning. Katzenbach and Smith, 1993, in The Wisdom of Teams, describe effective cooperative groups as a team with a small number of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, performance goals, and approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. Research indicates that there are important considerations when forming groups. First, Smith, 2008, as well as others, indicates that group size should be 3 to 4 students. According to Michelson and Black, 1994, groups should be heterogeneous. Finally, Allen, 2001, maintains that it is important to maximize diversity. What are some ways to develop community and identity among group members? Some considerations are having groups come up with a group name, share and learn similarities and differences, create an accountability system, create a group contract, and develop group roles. The benefits of cooperative group learning are many, including increased achievement and retention, critical thinking and higher level reasoning, differentiated views of others, accurate understanding of others' perspectives, and teamwork skills.
As Dan mentioned, how you structure cooperative group learning is key. Most learners really dislike group work when they all receive the same grade. Invariably, someone does more or less work, and the whole situation often becomes very frustrating for students. Cooperative learning theorists, namely the Johnson and Johnson brothers from the University of Minnesota, stress the need for individual accountability. I like to do this by weighting their grade for group work, and I do this in one of two ways. The first option is to assign 50% of their grade based on their individual contribution to the project. They clearly label their individual work. And then the other 50% of the grade is based on the quality of the composite group work. When I use this option, I structure the assignment so they must review and comment on one another's work before the final project is turned in. This provides incentive for learners to meaningfully critique the work of their peers. The second option is to tell learners that they have a fixed number of points, perhaps 10 on a 100-point group project, that they can anonymously assign to group members. I have them write these point values on a card for each group member, including themselves, but the total points assigned can't exceed the points I gave them to distribute. Once I collect the cards, I have a much better sense of how to assign my individual point values as a portion of the total grade.
Next, Jay and I are going to address reading in the content areas. Billmeyer and Barton, 1998, argue that reading in the content areas is about teaching students how to use reading as a tool for thinking and learning. Based on cognitive science research, Billmeyer and Barton outline 5 factors essential to teaching reading skills. 1. Meaning is constructed by making connections with what is known and what is being read. 2. Metacognition, thinking about the learning process before, during, and after the reading, is important for comprehension. 3. Teaching students how to write and edit text can help their reading comprehension. 4. It is important to allow students to collaborate in the learning process. And 5. One of the most important factors in successful reading of text is background knowledge.
Normally what happens with reading tasks is represented on the left side of your screen. An instructor provides a specified number of pages to read as part of a reading assignment. Then, the student theoretically reads the pages, but often one of two things happens. Number one, they never do the reading, or number two, they read the text, but they struggle with comprehension, often to the point of understanding only about 50% of what they read. Then the traditional process ends with the instructor trying to carry on a scintillating discussion that often flops because the learners never read the text, or if they did, they failed to comprehend much of what they read. The recommended best practice on the right side of the screen will yield higher levels of text comprehension. The process begins with pre-reading, in which the instructor may do one of several things within a 3 to 5 minute period of time. For example, you might start a brief text-related discussion, or provide an overview of the text and perhaps ask for a prediction, or pose several key questions that will be addressed in the text, or brainstorm related background knowledge, or introduce several key academic terms that are essential to know in order to comprehend the text. Interestingly, the research shows that time spent on selected pre-reading activities is extremely important in terms of motivating and preparing readers for success when they actually do read the text. During the actual reading phase, it's helpful for learners to be actively engaged through some form of questions or a study guide. These tools are especially helpful in that they help learners determine importance in what they're reading, a major challenge for our learners. The process then concludes with a brief discussion in which the instructor can address any questions, confusion, or misunderstandings that the reader may have. This is also a time the instructor can add additional content knowledge as appropriate.
The next category is use of technology. First, I will talk about using technology to flip the classroom. Bergman and Sams, 2012, in their book Flip Your Classroom, Reach Every Student in Every Class Every Day, make the case that there are 5 components of a flipped mastery classroom. They are 1. Establish clear learning goals. 2. Determine which objectives can be met through direct instruction and which can be met through inquiry. 3. Assure student access to videos. 4. Incorporate engaging learning activities in your classroom. 5. Provide multiple versions of the summative assessment. They contend that the benefits include students are able to take responsibility for their own learning, a classroom that is student-centered, an environment that includes multiple ways to learn and multiple ways to show understanding, and finally, instruction that can be easily personalized and differentiated.
Narrated PowerPoints are often thought to be the workhorse of delivering content for a flipped classroom or online instruction. In terms of tips, I suggest the rule of 6, which means using no more than 6 lines of text per slide and no more than 6 words per line. Many PowerPoint experts suggest even less text and more reliance on visual images to convey meaning and increase retention. In any event, it generally works best to script your text, record on a slide-by-slide basis, include learning targets, and seriously consider how learners must interact with your content. If you're using narrated PowerPoints to flip your classroom, it's helpful to pose the specific questions or situations you'd like learners prepared to discuss when they next enter your classroom. I do suggest getting a URL for each of your presentations, as this allows learners easy access to your materials through iPads, smartphones, tablets, etc. I also suggest using SmartArt Graphics, which is found in the toolbar of your PowerPoint program. SmartArt Graphics, used extensively in this presentation that Dan and I prepared for you, easily allows you to visually communicate lists and processes, cycles, relationships, and/or pictures.
The next category is assessment for learning. Specifically, I would like to discuss offering retakes on assessments. In her book, 7 Strategies of Assessment for Learning, Chapui, 2009, addresses 3 questions of assessment. Where am I going? Where am I now? And how do I close the gap? Often, after an assessment, a student, based on the teacher's feedback, is able to address the second question, where am I now? In some cases, the student has not shown mastery of the learning target. In other words, there is a significant gap between where they're at and where we would like them to be. Does it make sense just to move on? Using the feedback from the assessment, the student can now focus on the questions, What are my strengths? What do I need to work on? Where did I go wrong? And what can I do about it? Once the student and the teacher adequately address those questions, the student could be given a second chance to produce evidence of meeting the learning target or targets. Things to think about in terms of offering retakes. Will students receive full credit on retakes? How will the student and the teacher work together to close the gap? When will retakes be given? Finally, will multiple retakes of the same assessment be given?
If you are one who makes use of traditional assessment items, short answer, true false, matching, multiple choice, and limited response essay items, I suggest allowing students to add written comments to their papers if they feel they can make a case for why their response might be correct, even though you said it was incorrect. Once students have written these responses, and they generally don't do it for every incorrect item, you as an instructor collect the papers, read their comments, and let them know if you accepted their argument. Through the years, I've learned that students appreciate my efforts to be fair, but I also see this suggested practice as a way to deepen student thinking and help me to improve my test or quiz items. The first time I give a test or quiz, it's often filled with items that I call clunkers. These are items that are poorly written or don't measure what I intended to measure. When I get a number of students, especially my top students, challenging certain items, I often find that I can rewrite the item for greater clarity in the future.
Let's think for a few minutes about feedback. I'm going to talk about soliciting feedback from students about their learning, and Jay is going to talk about providing students with meaningful feedback. As stated before, Chapui 2009 addresses 3 questions of assessment. Where am I going? Where am I now? And how do I close the gap? Chapui maintains that teachers who know where their students are at in the learning process can teach students to self-assess and set goals through the questions, what am I good at? What do I need to work at? And what should I do next? Once this is done, teachers can address the third question of assessment, how do I close the gap? Chapui indicates that this can be done by designing lessons that focus on one aspect of quality at a time. Assessment identifies a need, and instruction can be adjusted to target that need. Taking a look at the slide, there are a number of ways to find out where students are at in the learning process. The use of some type of student response system can be effective during the class period. This can be done individually or in groups of 3 to 4. Pre-course surveys can help teachers identify possible misconceptions or conceptual frameworks that students might have related to the lesson. Teachers can determine what students already know in order to connect the lesson to the student's prior knowledge. Online discussions and tickets out the door are 2 effective ways a teacher can determine what has been learned and any questions that remain. Next, Jay will address the strategy offering regular descriptive feedback.
In terms of providing feedback, I'm about to share the 21st and a half tip. Why just a half tip? The reason is that I haven't fully tried this device enough to add my 100% endorsement, but the check brick that you see in this slide is really showing a lot of promise. The name check brick is derived from the name checklist and rubric. In the slide, you see a shortened version of what the completed tool looks like for one of my assignments. I'm only showing one criteria, and typically you'd have multiple criteria for a given assignment. A full check brick is provided to students along with a written assignment. When the assignment is completed, students are asked to self-assess with points and comments for each of the criteria. When the assignment is due, they turn in the completed assignment along with the completed check brick. As an instructor, I review the final work then submitted by the learner. I look at their self-assessment and then add my final point totals along with my comments for each of the criteria. Often my comments are in agreement or disagreement with their comments. I think the checkbrick shows a great deal of promise because it forces students to pay close attention to the assignment criteria, and it helps them to develop a valuable lifelong skill, self-assessment. The 21st and a half tip brings us to the conclusion of this narrated PowerPoint. As before, we'd like you to reflect on the strategies you've seen, and we'd like you to commit to trying 1 to 3 strategies, or more if that works for you in the near future. As you try new strategies, there are some steps that instructors typically pass through in the learning process. Please take a look at the next slide to see that progression. Trying a new strategy often begins with you reading or hearing an idea. Next, it's likely that you will either like or dislike a given idea based on how well you feel that strategy would work in your situation. Next, you should be able to articulate the idea to others. It's still all cognitive at this point, however. The I try step is where you become a risk taker because you never quite know how an idea will work until you try it. Once you've tried an idea, you can move to the I do stage, where you're feeling more confident in how learners will respond to your direction. Finally, you can reach the I do well stage with repeated attempts at a given strategy. Instructors in this particular stage almost always modify the original strategy to make it their own through experimentation. With that being said, Dan and I encourage you to take some risks and jump into the I try stage with the strategies that you selected.
Thanks for joining Jay and I in this PowerPoint presentation. We'd like to leave you with this final thought. Who dares to teach must never cease to learn. John Cotton Dana.